Good afternoon and welcome to the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art. My name is Kent Smith. I am the director of the museum, and I'm very grateful that all of you chose to spend some time with us this afternoon discussing some important topics. The symposium today is titled Kansas Schools, Native Americans, and the New Deal. The program's organized in conjunction with the museum's exhibition To the Stars Through Art, a history of art collecting in Kansas public schools from 1900 to 1950. It's worth mentioning this exhibition will remain on view and through May 11th, which I quickly consulted my calendar, and that is 4 weeks from today. So you have one more month to take that in. I also want to take a moment to thank the curator of that exhibition, our own Dr. Liz Seaton, for organizing today's program and bringing our exceptional speakers together. Funding for today's program is provided by Humanities Kansas, a nonprofit cultural organization that connects communities with history, traditions, and ideas to strengthen civic life. Before we proceed any further, I do want to take a moment to give thought to the land that we're on right now and the land that Kansas State University is built upon.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilized the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism, and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
These truths,
because we still remember.
So it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Alex Redcorn. A citizen of the Osage Nation, where he's a member of the Gentle Sky Peacekeeper Clan with family roots near Pawhuska, Oklahoma. In the College of Education at Kansas State University, he serves as Associate Professor of Educational Leadership, Coordinator of Indigenous Partnerships, Co-Chair of the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance, whom we would also like to thank for all of their gracious support and ongoing partnership with the museum. Dr. Redcorn is the Executive Director of the Kansas Association for Native American Education and Program Coordinator for the Indigenous Educational Leadership Graduate Certificate. In 2022, he also became the chair of the new Kansas Advisory Council for Indigenous Education Working Group. His scholarship and service are focused on building capacities for Native nations to take on a more prominent role in the education of their citizens. As a member of the College of Education faculty, Dr. Redcorn has consulted with school and tribal leaders across the region in a variety of topics related to education of Indigenous peoples. He has also developed the new Indigenous Educational Leadership Graduate Certificate Program, as well as partnership programs with the Osage Nation that has graduated 2 cohorts of Osage leaders with master's degrees in educational leadership. Additionally, Dr. Redcorn teaches courses in qualitative research methods, specializing in Indigenous approaches to research and autoethnography. Please welcome Dr. Alex Redcorn.
For those that don't know, I come from a family of artists, and I got a brother who's way more famous than me, and I just live in his shadow, and just praise the Lord that he's our great eagle, the eldest son of our family. But he's got a portrait down the hall, Uncle Mo. I like that that's sitting in this space because it represents innovation and ongoing perseverance. Uncle Mo, I remember the first time I heard him say it, he said, moving forward and adapting and continuing to move forward is one of our best traditions. like to talk about tradition a lot, all right? And tradition always gets assumed to be only in the past, but art gives us this engine to keep churning out new ideas and new innovative thought as indigenous peoples of the present. Considering we have that land acknowledgement, this is a land grant / land grab institution, and Kansas State University was established using all dispossessed land from the combination. Calls are some of our closest relatives to the Osage. So here we are, and I always like to use the term settler colonial entanglements coming from Osage anthropologist Gene Denniston. And here we are entangled in an institution because this institution was set up for the purposes of conquest. That's just the reality of it. But over time, as we continue to innovate and persevere, we also start to rethink how we can change the purpose of some of our institutions with events such as these within them that wouldn't have occurred in previous decades or in previous generations necessarily. And so I'm happy to be here to talk about the ongoing perseverance of Native peoples, even with the backdrop of a lot of use of educational systems as weapons against Indian peoples. And art is one of the most, is one of the best ways to celebrate those and have conversations about art as well. So without further ado, that's all I want to say to introduce, and I want to say thank you for coming here and thank you for having me be part of this. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, if that's all right.
Kevin Slivka worked with Ojibwe artists from northern Minnesota and indigenous artists from Colorado who have heavily informed his professional interests concerning cultural studies, indigenous knowledges, and ecological relationships embedded within the art process. He previously served as Associate Professor of Art Education with the State University of New York, SUNY, at New Paltz as Director of the program from 2017 to 2020, and Slivka also serves as Assistant Professor at the University of Northern Colorado and currently teaches 2D Fine Arts Studio courses with the Mary Institute in St. Louis Country Day School in St. Louis, Missouri. And today he's going to talk about assimilationist practices and in arts and crafts at Carlisle Indian School.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me, Liz, for coming here today to talk about art and craft and assimilation during the boarding school. Thank you, Alex, for that introduction. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody in attendance today. Thanks for coming. I have the privilege today to talk about what happened during the boarding school, but my work also actually involves contemporary art practices. And so unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about that, but I'm definitely going to focus on what happened at the Carlisle School, just to set the foundation and set the sort of the experience of what happened during that time frame. So off-reservation schools for Native Americans during the late 1800s were seen as the best, most effective approach by government policymakers and reformists in solving America's, quote, Indian and white relations problem, end quote. The first off-reservation school to be funded by the United States government was organized and founded by Richard Henry Pratt in 1879, not too far from the founding of the city just down the road, 10 years later. During the early years, Pratt worked as the superintendent of the Carlisle Indian School located in Pennsylvania. He emphasized the deep acculturation for an increased ease for assimilation for a practical and useful citizenry. Pratt believed that the only way to save the native race was to separate, educate, and eliminate the Indian culture identity. In doing so, quote, deculturalization is what Joel Spring in 2008 describes as an education for democracy and political equity with cultural genocide, the attempt to destroy cultures. And this was practiced overtly at the Carlisle School and later expressed in Rill's 1901 curriculum titled Course for Study of Indian, a course of study for Indian schools. Pedagogical practices within both contexts specifically pertain to art and craft education were paradoxical, claiming to educate for independence while setting strict limitations on class position, employment, learned skills, and academic knowledge. In 1890, Pratt stated in the 11th annual report for the Indian Industrial School that the primary intention was to teach the English language to support practical knowledge as a means for self-support among civilized people, end quote. Practical knowledge, according to Pratt, meant establishing gendered forms of education where boys were schooled in mechanical arts and farming, while the girls were schooled in cooking, sewing, laundry, and other forms of housework. Much of Pratt's educational language mirrors the ideals used for spreading manual training in the United States during the 1800s. Art educator and historian Mary Ann Stankovich in 2001 explains that manual training was intended for the urban and rural poor as a means to quote, create a desire for literacy by making education more meaningful, and that handiwork was expected to provide jobs for rural folk, discouraging them from migrating to the city. This is important because the native population was very much viewed as a rural or poverty-stricken population, unfortunately, and therefore manual training had much to do with, quote, improving their conditions. The Carlisle School followed the program of the Hampton Normal Agricultural Institute for African American and Native students that emphasized enculturation. Samuel Armstrong, who established the Hampton School in Virginia, justified his educational philosophy by stating, quote, that the Negro and the Indian races are especially in need of mechanical education to fit them for the sphere that they shall occupy, end quote. A significant curricular difference between the industrial school and the Hampton School was the outing system. Pratt believed that the core requirement for a successful educational model for improving Native and white relations included preparing Native students to live and work among Anglo-American families during the summer months as laborers, earning, quote, a per diem of 24 cents a day. This differed from Hampton's design, where the school was isolated from the nearby white communities. Pratt's curriculum made the Carlisle School more successful in assimilating its students in Anglo culture. Paradoxically, Pratt also claimed that the Native students have little skill in comprehending the English language due to a lack of understanding the linguistic processes. Therefore, the primary educational focus was to gain knowledge from observing and doing. Pratt rationalized that the students gained satisfaction from creating a final product rather than engaging in the processes, thereby student production or labor was overemphasized in creating and repairing everyday materials needed for the industrial school. This product-oriented education manifested in objects such as shoes, tinware, clothing, harnesses, wagons, and pipes, as well as farming 300 lands of acre. Beyond the gendered forms of industrial education content, Pratt believed that he was educating the Indian race as a means to save them from themselves. Quote, in 1892, he stated, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man," end quote. Pratt's advocacy for a practical educational model was explained more thoroughly as he argued against the oppressive conditions of reservation life that stifled occupational opportunity. He hoped that the Native students educated at Carlisle would witness the difference and experience the better conditions of civilized life through the activity of an occupation and then assimilate into an Anglo society. Pratt further stated that the freedom and the individualisms were goals that countered the oppressive states of the reservation life, which sought to segregate and weld the tribes into separate and petty nations. This is what was shown before. And that schools were the implement to break up the tribal slavery. Pratt's rhetoric seems to be blinded by the structures that have created the Native tribes' poor socioeconomic conditions and creates a narrative based on liberation from the socialistic nature of the tribal life. So, for instance, much of the Native way was disrupted, corrupted, devastated by the mid-1800s. Tribes were removed from their lands, disconnected from communities, local foods and environments, traditional hunting, fishing and gathering practices, and displaced into territories that were unwanted by settlers. In doing so, they became wards of the United States government at that time. Rations such as flour and lard were never part of the natives' diet, but became staple foods as traditional ways of life were disrupted. Throughout the 1800s, Native peoples endured removal from land, genocide, extreme alteration of their diet, and still Pratt wished to break the familiar bonds that ground every individual's identity. Specific modes of assimilation are evidenced through all practices in the Carlisle School, and from teaching agriculture to providing military-style uniforms to the strict enforcement of learning and speaking the English language. However, rarely investigated are the visual representations and the curricular practices embodied by the domains of art and craft. The re-imaging of Indigenous students through visual representations began, I don't have that here, with before and after photographs. Pratt employed the photographer of Choate to create a visual record of Native students' appearances at the Carlisle School as propaganda. Choate created a visual record of Native students' appearances at the Carlisle School as propaganda and evidence of students' assimilation and progress towards becoming a civilized student. He used front lighting and white powder in the before and after images to depict a whitening process evidenced by short hair, Anglo-American clothing, and lighter skin. Choate's photography techniques created an appearance of acculturation, and this was circulated highly. Right? This is just one example of that. The techniques of using before and after images began at the Hampton School with the help of Choate, and Pratt reproduced that method of visual representation at Carlisle. He would insist on images taken upon the arrival so as to document the, quote, the native state. Afterwards, students were marched to have their hair cut, which was often met with resistance and tears, as one Carlisle student recalled that, quote, it hurt my feelings to an extent that tears came to my eyes, end quote, and I was standing bare in 1928. The whitening process depicted in the photographs of students can be read as a visual language that embodies assimilation through the projection of specific cultural identifiers. Michel Foucault his notion of docile bodies, which are born by how one may have a hold over others' bodies, not only so that they may do what one wishes, but also how they may operate, is reinforced by the photographic image that produces modern state citizens who participate in the ideologies of society through the desire to fit in and conform. The before and after images exemplify an imposed conformity masked by the process of education, philanthropy, and controlled propaganda, while displaying an actual power dynamic that unfolds as processes implied through the photographic image. Another form of before and after visual reimaging used by Pratt was the pictographs created by Carlisle students. And that was an example of some of the work that students were doing during their time at Carlisle. This form of pictorial work can be attributed to the influences of the Plains Indians held as prisoners during Pratt's earlier post at Fort Marion, Florida. A lot of work at the Cumberland Historical Society. She posits that these lasting pictographic works embody Plains arts traditions, which are described as an action flowing from right to left, a stylized dress details, conventionalized horse with a small head and long, graceful neck, an absence of background details, flat colors, figures and distant objects placed higher on the page, but not less distinct. And although these pictographic works were drawn using a set of conventions, much of the art training was modeled after copying still life arrangements of floral imagery and sometimes idealized landscapes. The pictographics are quite difficult to interpret with authenticity because their families did not necessarily teach these forms of representation to the native students. Whitner posits that when native students arrived from diverse tribes, they, quote, undoubtedly met and were influenced by the 13 Fort Marion Indian prisoners who were artists, who also came to Carlisle while they were imprisoned. It is difficult to determine students' prior knowledge of visual representations, and tracing those influences and determining authenticity can become conjecture. But in the context of a government school that aimed to assimilate students, one can deduce that teaching students to create representations of Anglo-American content, such as still life drawings, are ideological in nature and intended to change the way natives viewed the world. Whitmer believes that Pratt saw these drawings as propaganda to promote the assimilation process, which inculcated the use of education as a means to civilize the native population. Today, students' drawings can be critically examined for the subject matter depicting cultural signifiers while determining the presence of assimilation efforts. Using a before and after lens to analyze students' artist drawings, one can clearly see conventions, which is seen here in the still life, right? One can see those conventions as perspective, layered tones, and shadowing, as well as evidence from assimilation signified by the change in subject matter. This is a change in that subject matter. European conventions replaced the descriptions of the Plains Art conventions as Pratt's acculturation process unfolds, clearly divorcing students from their previously held notions of a visual language. The separation of Native youths from their families redressed in American clothing with shortened hair and simulated lightened skin were also changes in appearances and associations, while changes in visual language through instruction were direct attempts, right? Direct attempts to change the way the natives saw and interpreted their world. And the latter is much more subtle assault on Native culture while affirming Anglo-American dominance and motivation to reproduce the world in their likeness. So using the before lens and the after lens on a detailed drawing, which is what is being showed right now. This was on the back of a drawing that was done by a Native student at the Carlisle School. And I don't have the information of actually, and they didn't have the information of who did the drawing, but it was on the reverse side of another drawing. This was an exposed image, and I found it interesting in the fact that there's an emphasis on the Anglo-American militarized efforts while the native on horseback is shooting back. So there is a pushback in these drawings as well. But what follows, right, is that an offering of peace, right? These drawings came out during the time that Pratt was in superintendence at the Carlisle School. And so these were also used as propaganda to show the prominence and the evidence of assimilation processes. But it's clearly divorced from any physical violence or physical aggression. And these images, according to Whitmer, were never part of the Plains art traditions. And so these sort of friendship images, they embody the idea of Carlisle's goal for resolving Native and white relations. Even though the drawings are stylistically representing the Plains art tradition, the schooling at Carlisle has influenced the production of this image, or these images, as the student removes any conflicting imagery between Native and Anglo-American soldiers, erasing past aggressions towards Native people. And so this image by Calvin Redwolf represents a before image, if we use that lens, and it highlights a Native American narrative. There are 5 Native peoples in the composition, all in action or rising to action, and Whitmer posited that this scene depicts a warring tribes, but it can also be interpreted as a meeting between differing tribes, since they enter the picture plane from various directional positions. Their dress, which is illustrated differently, their weapons are passively integrated into the depiction, and one Native warrior has a hand position as a greeting, similar to what was in the greeting before. So there's a similar hand positioning within those images. And then the after image, right, is devoid of any Native representations and instead represents 2 Anglo-Americans holding rings, possibly for the leisure game of ring toss, while commingling with domesticated animals. This scene appears to be replicated from an art card or an instructional guide, and it's just from a printed resource. And so that sort of idea of copying was a mimetic idea of, again, instilling an ideological concept of worldview. So these examples of native pictographic work symbolize and embody evidence of assimilation efforts to alter, influence, and erase native visual perspectives and native narratives. As the Carlisle School entered the 20th century, native students' pictographic work ceased to be produced. Pratt was removed from his superintendency of the Carlisle School, and after 25 years, and a new era of fixating a generalized curriculum for native students was created. And so by 1901, Estelle Real, superintendent of Indian schools within the Office of Indian Affairs, created an extensive curriculum guide titled Course of Study for Indian Schools. It was the first formally written, published, and distributed curriculum intended for all Native students in the government-run schools. Real's primary goal, which was indicative of popular beliefs at the time and reformists, was to achieve a quickened route in providing an education that would produce a usefulness and appreciation for citizenship. Real, like Pratt, set out to teach the English language in support of a useful citizenship that emphasized individuality. She believed an industrial education was necessary for creating and instilling, quote, a willing worker who was both active and inquisitive. Real also believed that the industrial form of education would, quote, awaken a child's capacity and quicken his interests as a means to emphasize the individual nature of westernized culture through the pursuit of knowledge versus the pluralistic and communal nature of native cultures at the time. Real's approach to education mirrored Pratt's, as his was a practical form of education where learning English was accomplished by doing, or in other words, by working. More specifically, Real discussed both the schoolroom and the use of chalk on the blackboard as a way of practice, as a way of compared to other modes of training within systems of industry. She emphasized cleanliness directly through regular bathing and indirectly through a moral education intended to, quote, whitewash the native students through a world outlook. Just 11 years earlier, mind you, at 1901, right, 11 years earlier, school showers were introduced to American public schools as a response to an increasing immigrant population from Southern and Eastern Europe. Historian Joel Spring posits that most of the early Western European Americans were believed that these new arrivals were inherently dirty, lacked civility, and were in need of assimilated reform. And then, of course, it's of no surprise then to see cleanliness enter into Real's rhetoric for the course of study for Indian schools, which especially focused on immigrants and natives were seen as social problems during the 19th and 20th centuries. Similar to Pratt, though, Real also influenced the curriculum framework utilized at Hampton. She borrows both frameworks, infiltrating, which was focusing on an infiltrating immigrant population and an already present minority problem within Anglo society, which she was trying to address corrective education for the native students. And Real stated that, quote, better morals, a more patriotic and Christian citizenship, and the ability for self-support will result from what this course of study may inspire. Real's curriculum is extensive, and it represents the dominant model of European culture and sensibilities at the time. Agriculture was the most extensive portion of Real's curriculum, which entailed 34 pages, and this included areas devoted to crop rotation, managing ditches, fences, and independence among other topics. And other areas that were really lengthy. Real's curriculum included 27 pages on nature study, 22 pages on sewing, 18 pages on gardening and carpentry. And she concluded the agriculture section with a strong advocacy for independence by, quote, working the soil, thereby making Indian boys industrious, practical farmers and self-supporting citizens. Her attention to detail within this section of agriculture indicates that the belief and rationale of the native place within American society, which was characterized by manual farm labor. Although the overall curriculum emphasized domains that was particular to domesticity and land maintenance, portions of the curriculum guide were devoted to craft and production of artisan wares. It is within these fixed content areas that Reel's curriculum elucidates Spring's 2009 notion of deculturalization, which paradoxically claims to educate for independence while setting strict limitations on class position, employment, learned skills, and academic knowledge. Reel began the basketry curriculum with a letter that addressed Native peoples and superintendents of schools that requested information on basket makers who resided on local reservations. And she appears as a reformer and a supporter of the natives. And in 1901, she appeals to craft teachers from the reservations, and she states, quote, "Indian basket makers are desired as teachers who have the skill and ability who use the old methods of coloring of beautiful and lasting dyes," end quote. She also is very supportive of inculcating Native ideology represented in and by material culture objects, as she also wants to recruit, quote, "those who understand weaving into their baskets the design which symbolize the history and the traditions of their tribe, making them distinctively Indian." And finally, she concludes that the basketry, as woven by Indians for generations past, is fast becoming a lost art and must be revived by the children of the present generation, that they may take their rightful place among the leading basket makers of the world and supply the demands of the market for such baskets. So while Reel is attempting to revive a cultural tradition indicative of cultural identity that's not being practiced, and by all appearances, it seems to be a noble cause, and it's reflective of the reformist approaches to educate at the time. Native cultural traditions and identities were not necessarily lost or being not practiced or passed down within tribal communities because they were eradicated by earlier traditional or educational endeavors that epitomized Pratt's approach, which focused on familial separation and assimilation. And additionally, closer scrutiny of the quote reveals that Reel's intent was not to perpetuate a meaningful cultural tradition. Rather, she focused on the use of the cultural mode as a commodity to be exploited in order to supply the demands of the market. She continued with similar dialogue, stating that the inherent skill shows that the wisdom of the training, quote, should be employed for commodification and placed upon the markets that targeted basketry, blanket weavers, and potters as well. Reel stated that modernized adaptations created in Native peoples' material culture objects, quote, cheapened the wearer of the Indian, and his individuality does not assert itself as it should, as it does in all of the work of the old Indians of generations past. She posited that since the tendency of the tribes is the copy from modern wearers, the work is not distinctly Indian, right? Adapting or responding to European influences in craft work is an inauthentic approach for indigenous productivity. And that was the view at the time that sort of perpetuates our timeline. And as Alex had mentioned, the idea of the presence and moving forward, the idea of transmotion is really important. But these statements are in line with reformist approaches that were sought to undo earlier work embodied by Pratt, who was looking to remove the Indian from the man. Even though this statement appears to be sympathetic to the Native students' experience in the United States boarding schools, it ultimately limits the inherent nature of cultural convergence and attempts to fix and romanticize a constructed notion of the Native identity. Additionally, this mode of reform oversimplifies, generalizes, and prescribes cultural practices to all Native students, regardless of their actual tribal background, and to those whose Native identity has no correspondence to the craft practices that were being prescribed at the time. So I'm going to end there. I have a lot more, but I don't have all the time that I could use to explain. So I'm going to pass my presentation over to Travis, who's going to pick up where I left off.
Travis Campbell is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma who is of Choctaw and Delaware descent. He completed his bachelor's degree in Indigenous and American Indian Studies at Haskell in 2017, and he completed a master's degree in Library and Information Science with an emphasis on archival studies at Emporia State University in 2019. In May of 2023, he became the new director of the Haskell Cultural Center and Museum at Haskell Indian Nations University, combining over a decade of experience working in archives and museums to lead this internationally known institution. And really what's great about this 1-2 punch to start out, two of the most famous Indian boarding schools, Haskell and Carlisle. And Haskell, that's in Kansas, is a representation of that onward perseverance and has been repurposed over time, and is a really fascinating story if you ever stop and think about it, what it started as and what it continues to be to this day. So welcome, Travis.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you already heard, my name is Travis Campbell, and I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and of Kituah, Choctaw, and Delaware descent as well. As Dr. Redcorn said, I have been the director of the Haskell Cultural Center and Museum for almost a year now, and I would like to just share a little bit about our museum and what we do. And we opened in 2002 with the mission to preserve and share Haskell's history, and essentially starting from the beginning of Haskell's opening to what it has become today as a four-year university. In 1884, the United States Indian Industrial Training School at Lawrence, Kansas, later known as Haskell Institute, opened its doors as part of the federal government's goal of assimilating Native American youth into mainstream American society. Between 1819 and 1900, hundreds of such schools were opened across the western United States, all of them sharing this assimilationist mission with what can essentially be described as cultural genocide as the ultimate goal. Upon arrival, students were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair cut, and issued military-styled uniforms. In some cases, students were even renamed by the school officials. The opening of such a school was obviously big news in the communities in which they were opening and were met with a great deal of public fascination. In the case of Haskell, one of the local newspapers, the Lawrence Journal, dated September 18th, 1884, reported on the opening ceremonies and references remarks made by Joshua Lippincott, Chancellor of the University of Kansas, stating that he gave a number of illustrations from his own observation showing that these children are not only capable of learning rapidly, but are very anxious to get out of the old Indian ways. Lippincott, having served for 3 years as a chaplain at the Carlisle Indian Industrial Training School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, had become familiar with the boarding schools and their often inhumane methods, but remained ignorant to the trauma and heartbreak that this caused the students and their families. In Haskell's earliest years, students were recruited by both the school administration and former students who were sent to reservation communities to meet with tribal leaders and plead the case for them to send their young people to school. This changed, however, in 1891 with the passage of the Compulsory Indian Education Act, which enabled federal officials to remove children as young as 3 and 4 years of age with the authorization to use force if need be from their families and send them to these schools where they would remain for periods of up to 10 years. At the same time, as early as the 1890s, while there was evidently an appreciation for items that had been made in what was being described as the old Indian ways, it was made painfully clear to these students upon their arrival that these boarding schools were not the proper place for creating these objects. In the first few decades of the school's existence, after students were forcibly separated from their families, stripped of their clothing, and any personal handmade items brought with them were also taken away. Confiscated objects deemed of notable craftsmanship were displayed in a glass case outside of the administration office, while other items, particularly items of jewelry, clothing, anything that was deemed inferior in quality and artistic value by the school administration, was disposed of by burning. The true threat to these traditions by the boarding schools, however, came from the separations of families and the resulting disruption to familial traditions. Despite the efforts of these reforming influences in schools for Indigenous peoples across the United States and Canada, the creation of handmade items and the incorporation of traditional designs was still thriving amongst Native American artists living in tribal communities. An excellent example seen here is the work of the artist Nampeo, who was born in 1859 and died in 1942. A Hopi potter, Nampeo had her first work exhibited in Paris in 1885. She learned her craft in the traditional fashion from her grandmother and heavily incorporated ancient Hopi designs that reflected her background and culture. Some of the designs used by Nampeo came from her own research into designs found on pieces that were being uncovered by archaeologists. Going beyond pottery, further examples can be found amongst the skillful Navajo weavers of this time, who learned every aspect of their craft, from raising and shearing the sheep, to dyeing and spinning the wool, to the designs and weaving techniques that they would be using at home from their families or members of their own communities. It is through the continual teaching of these valuable techniques in Navajo families that this practice survives and flourishes today. At the boarding schools, however, the prevailing attitudes began to shift much later. In the early decades of the 20th century, the change occurs under the guidance of Estelle Real, superintendent of Indian schools, and through the employment of Angel Decora, a Winnebago artist at the Carlisle Indian Industrial Training School from 1905 till 1915. Real's 1909 publication of a craft curriculum shows an appreciation for Native American basketry techniques and materials, but as a means for generating income rather than its significance as a tangible piece of cultural heritage. The curriculum at Haskell Institute, however, took significantly longer to make these changes. By the 1930-1931 school year, arts and crafts had been introduced to the home economics department curriculum, with the school's annual reporting that in arts and crafts, each high school student weaves at least one piece. Some of the girls weave rag rugs to be used in the dormitories. Others make draperies, table runners, pillow tops in colonial patterns or tapestry weaving using Indian designs. 11 looms are in use daily. And I thought this was a phenomenal image from that 1931 annual, because you can actually see the looms that the students are using down there in that bottom illustration. The most notable part of this small but significant blurb in this text here that I would like to really emphasize is the quote, "using Indian designs," as this reflects the written acknowledgement of the beginning of a shift in the school's philosophy towards the appreciation of traditional Native American arts and crafts designs, as well as their incorporation into items meant for daily use, such as baskets. And this was an inadvertent nod to the historical roots of these items, their creation, their designs, and their cultural significance. These skills, however, were not being taught in any semblance of a traditional method, which would have incorporated a situation akin to an internship with an artist from within their own family or community. Usually this would be done over the course of several years. Instead, at Haskell, these skills were taught in a more formal classroom setting and by non-Indigenous instructors. This removal from the traditional environment in which these students would have learned the skills, techniques, and individual meanings of the designs meant that the curriculum was disconnected from the students' own cultural context. This disconnect and the difference in teaching methodology is exemplified in the school's newspaper reporting on the weekly pottery class. The industrial arts class for normal training and home economics students meets with Miss Mabel Morrow every Saturday morning. Last Saturday, this class began pottery work, and the students are quite enthused with the work, although their first efforts were not quite up to their expectations. While the focus was heavily on design and methodology, classes in these skills were taught without the inclusion of the vitally important cultural aspects of this information, such as how to locate clay deposits, how to source and prepare the clay, as well as gathering and preparing materials used for pigments in traditional designs. This knowledge would have differed from community to community, of course, and its omission in the classroom setting would have forced the pupils to obtain the information independently after returning to their home communities, or to rely upon materials that were commercially available, as they would have at school. Additionally, the short amount of time that was devoted to each particular craft or skill meant that the students would have been made aware of certain aspects of creating these objects, but were not provided sufficient time to obtain the level of mastery that would have come from a traditional style of learning. The 1934 passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, or the Indian New Deal, led to further commoditization of these skills with the recruitment of Native American boarding school graduates and students to serve as counselors at summer camps. The Indian Reorganization Act was intended to decrease federal control of tribal nations through an increase in tribal self-governance, and is responsible for the tribal constitutions and governments that we see today. An outspoken proponent of the Indian Reorganization Act and supporter of John Collier, the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was Dr. Henry Rocloud, Haskell's first Native American superintendent. As a result of this, readers of the Indian Leader, the school newspaper, during his 1933 to 1935 tenure, we'll see a number of editorials written by Dr. Rocloud promoting New Deal policies and its influence in the curriculum changes in accordance with these policies. An article by R.C. Starr that was reprinted in the 1934 commencement edition of the Indian Leader stated that here he can make quite naturally his contribution, not as a curiosity or as a showman, but as the bearer of the proud, worthy culture and sacred traditions of a stately race, sharing these with his fellow campers of another race, in the woods, by the streams, under the stars, beside the fire, as a leader and counselor of boys and girls. The Indian enriches white culture, promotes racial understanding and mutual respect, and at the same time builds firmer by service the structure of independent and self-respecting white and Indian character. The course of instruction covers Indian handicrafts, Indian songs and dances, Indian lore and legends, Indian history, and campfire programs. So while this article claims that the counselors were not participating as curiosities or showmen, I think it's arguable that this is exactly what they were doing by engaging in these performative activities. Another equally disturbing aspect of this is the notion that these activities were being performed specifically to enrich white culture, rather than teach their own people and perpetuate activities integral to their own cultural heritage. This is further evidenced in a 1933 article written by a Haskell student, Joe Pajarito, in which he discusses his experiences working as a counselor at a summer camp for white boys in Alabama. He won this position his second night at Haskell by playing a contest game with other students and actually won this sort of internship as an award in the game. In the article, he states that my duties were varied during the camp season. I taught the boys some Indian lore, stories, singing, and dancing. I also taught them to do beadwork, weave baskets, make bows and arrows, and several other minor forms of crafts. He also wrote that I tried each day to express my thoughts in my work in order to lead the white people I came in contact with to see that the Indian is worth, to see what the Indian is worth. I tried to get them to forget their old ideas and misconceptions about the Indian as a bloodthirsty human who wants to scalp every white man he meets. In addition to being trained as camp counselors, students at Haskell Institute were creating pieces for the school to sell, with the students receiving a portion of the proceeds. Unfortunately, while this was immediately beneficial for the student artists, this practice left Haskell with a woeful lack of examples of verifiable student art from these courses. Fortunately, over the years, many pieces of student art from this time have found their way back to us, but we're always on the lookout for other examples, especially from these early years. So if any of you come across anything out there, please let us know. Students in the Arts and Craft program also created a series of marionettes that were used in performances across the United States, telling adaptations of traditional stories. In the 1935-1936 school year, students traveled as far away as Anadarko, Oklahoma to give these presentations. And these are two of the marionettes here that they created and traveled with. More promising avenues of preserving cultural legacies were being pursued in the same time period, albeit still using language that was paternalistic and questionable in tone. A piece from the 1933 and published in Haskell Student newspaper discusses the opening of a tribal museum operated by its own citizens at the boarding school on the reservation of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina. It is worth noting that within 5 years of the publication of this article in 1933, the Osage Nation would open the Osage Nation Museum in 1938 in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Today, the Osage Nation Museum is still in operation and is the oldest tribally owned and operated museum in the United States and the world. Aside from the obvious negatives in methodology and practice employed in teaching these skills at the government schools, there were positive outcomes. One notable veteran of the Arts and Crafts program at Haskell Institute was Walter Richard West. A 1935 graduate, he participated in Miss Malm's courses at Haskell Institute and went on to study the fine arts at the University of Oklahoma, where he became one of the first Native Americans to earn the degree of Master of Fine Arts in 1951. After this, he gained acknowledgement as the dean of the flat style of painting popularized by several Native American artists in Oklahoma that was known as the Southern Plain style. Exemplified here in this 1975 painting, Blue Sky People, depicting representatives from Cheyenne warrior societies in a teepee. This distinct style was developed and popularized by a group of Oklahoma-based Native American artists known as the Kiowa Six in the 1920s, and was heavily influenced by the methods taught at the San Ildefonso and Santa Fe Indian schools in New Mexico. This flat style of painting led to the creation of the Bacone style later in the 1930s, as these artists began teaching students of their own. In his work, West drew heavily upon his early childhood experiences and immersion into the cultural traditions of the Southern Cheyenne. He later returned to Haskell, by this time a junior college, where he served as the chair of the art department from 1970 to 1977. Under his leadership, Haskell's art department included semester-long courses in pottery and silversmithing. So it's a far cry from the week that was being allocated to pottery during his time as a student. A significant number of pieces from the silversmithing classes under his guidance survive today at Haskell and serve to beautifully illustrate the superb craftsmanship and abilities of these students. Due in part to West's influence, the art department at Haskell Indian Nations University is thriving today, as students now have the encouragement and freedom to express their cultural traditions through a variety of mediums. Thank you.
We're reckoning with the history of our boarding schools and unmarked grave sites that have been found at many. And I'm just wondering what information you have. I know Deb Howland has been working towards finding that, if you have information about unmarked graves at Haskell or at Carlisle.
I was actually part of Secretary Howland's initiative on boarding schools, so I helped prepare the report. We have begun ground penetrating radar surveys on site at Haskell, but that's really the only information we're able to disclose at this point in time.
I had a question about ledger art. That's something I know a little bit about. I teach Kansas history here at K-State. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how ledger art fits in with some of the topics that you discussed, because the imagery, at least in your presentation especially, very much reminded me of that.
Ledger art is school art, right? So it's off typical format, off media. And so, yeah, ledger art is definitely a specific mode. And I think there are a number of artists that have sort of reclaimed it as a medium. Not my forte to expand beyond that, but the idea like it's school art. It happened in schools. It's based off of working on paper, right? And so that format, again, has that framework, right, of educational, ideological intentions, right, of reframing students' beliefs. But the thing is that, again, there's always pushback. It's not always one way. And so I think it's really important to figure out, what the representation is. I think there's a book that's out there that's, I think it's highly popular, but again, it's done by a white man, and but it's still sort of prolificated as Indian ledger art, but it's not. So I think I have to do a little bit of research to figure out exactly what that text is, but I would just be careful with that, and look to contemporary artists who are actually using it as a format to create stories and push back against what happened, or illustrate contemporary lifeways.
And one of the things we're talking about is how, there is this shift, right? And that you are getting this curriculum that emerges at boarding schools, maybe later at Haskell, that is at least allowing some kind of expression of indigenous arts and crafts traditions, right? But what seems sort of consistent is the idea of creating marketable skills, right? This idea that, the white society has to teach Native Americans how to work in a white society. So I'm wondering, do you think, is that a continuous ideology throughout this entire, let's say, late 1800s through the 1940s? Does that change at all? And I'm also wondering, when we see this shift where you're seeing students learning indigenous artistic practices, is there anything else underneath it, behind it, from the administration's perspective, other than, oh, white people want to buy this stuff now, right? Is that really what's going on, or is it more complicated?
I feel like it's a little more complicated than that, especially in the case at Haskell, because the arts and crafts curriculum came onto the ground so late here, and it was essentially timed just right before the arrival of our first Native American superintendent. So I think that that appreciation was there in addition to this is what's marketable to the white audience. In fact, in the late 40s, early 50s, they changed the marketing slogan at Haskell to learn to earn. Learn to earn. And so they were trying to funnel Haskell students through the school and then to put them into service under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So there was definitely always this mindset of this is what's going to make you money, there's a reason for your education. It's not for your benefit, it is for the benefit of society, and this is why you're here.
Kevin, do you know at Carlisle, when there was a shift, when they started to teach in Indigenous arts, was it a similar philosophy?
I mean, I think it was always pervasive in the fact that it was always commodity driven. I mean, there was definitely a pan-Indigenous sort of movement, sort of to blanket the approach. It didn't matter where students came from, but you're just going to produce, again, to satisfy the markets. And again, it wasn't about, again, destruction of property. It was, again, marketing, selling, and collecting. It was about all of that, right? It was about removing that material object from where it came from, but also then producing something new and faux. And just as Travis had mentioned, right, it just sort of continued. And I think, I think one of the greatest sort of stolen history is the fact that, modern art happened because of Native work, right? And it didn't get qualified until it manifested itself onto a canvas. Right? And so it was, again, object-based. And again, it had to be done in a certain way, and it had to be for a certain audience. And that narrative hasn't stopped. I mean, that's the history, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I might I was reflecting on this and I was typing some notes when you all were talking too about the commodification piece was a super easy to see theme, but how that is translated all the way into today and how it continues to happen into today. I mean, I wouldn't call it art, but the imagery, the storylines, the narrative, all the way, the Kansas City Chiefs have commodified it, all right? And so like how that continues to unfold. But I think what's really interesting is there was a piece when one of you guys were talking about how the process behind the art and going to get the clay and going to pick up the clay and go. So I think what's important, an important thread that needs to be kind of named is the idea that commodification and industrialization was the era of that time, industrialization, the progressive era, and the product of art was the commodity, but it starts to become detached from the process. So the product becomes a symbol of exotic Indians that they've read about in books, and they start to see them in Westerns in latter years. However, what starts to become detached is the actual processes surrounding the art. All right, and I think about just our own ceremonies and how I'm wearing a lot of art and I'm sweating my butt off in it, and it's there and it's expensive art, but it's about being in community with people and the processes that surround ceremonies. And so people will see crafts or artistic objects and they will be gravitated towards their natural beauty, and they'll be like, wow, this is neat and cool, but that's been detached from all the things. So then all of a sudden, when you put it in a glass case in a museum, all of a sudden it's not used. It's not living. It's not actually part of that process. And so I think there's a really important reflection coming out of this is that these kids were taken out of their communities and they did what they could and they expressed themselves in what they had available to them, yet they were still being detached from the cultural processes and activities and relationships that happen when doing art and those things. And so I think that's a reflective thread of mine. I don't know if you guys want to add it.
This curriculum was based on being able to, create income, and in some cases was actually being sold by the schools. And so I'm curious about who was actually profiting from that, and did these funds actually end up going back into the schools for any kind of improvements that the students would actually be able to see, or was that completely kind of distanced and, from the students and their labor.
I can tell you at Haskell, for instance, that the students did receive a percentage of the sales, but the bulk of it went back into the program to buy additional supplies. So it kept the program sort of self-sufficient.
And the same goes for the Carlisle School. I mean, they advocated that the fact that, if you're buying these material goods, the students would benefit. And some of the images that I was showing were actually generated by Native students at the time. So they did produce images that were, sent out through the Red Man or the Indian Craftsman at the time. That was the sort of the titles of those publications. But they were always overstocked, right? And so there's definitely some panopticon sort of aspect of what happened. But you can always see there's pushback, right, in some of those images, or at least a couple of those images that were sent or showed. But who knows exactly if the students received it, even if they were said that they would, right? It's hard to say.
The idea that basically you have this commodification and people like teaching these students how to commodify, and it's all about creating a product that you can sell, create a product you can sell. But then fast forward, and people talk about sovereignty a lot in Indian country. But they're usually talking about federal trust responsibility, but like there's another layer of sovereignty, and I love to quote Osage academic Robert Warrior when he talks about intellectual sovereignty. And this intellectual sovereignty and this free thinking is being cultivated in here, and I love that, was it Dr. West? And so like you have these conditions for like still keeping some of that innovation alive, even though it's probably not the most ideal situation, what we would call ideal now, and they start moving this intellectual sovereignty into the future. However, non-natives really like to take exotic, neat-looking native ideas and things and designs and use them as their own. And so the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990 solidifies the idea that you can't be saying that you're doing Indian art if you're not actually Indian. And when you go to the Haskell Indian Art Market, they got all their tribal affiliations tagged on every single booth, so you know who these people are, where they're coming from. So, but anyway, one piece of history I wanted to put out there, because boarding school, American Indian history. The Merriam Report is kind of a big thing lurking in the back of this story, and that is 1926, 28. Okay, 1928. Basically, federal government, just like the boarding school initiative, the federal government was like, guys, we need to do a little bit of investigation. Is this boarding school thing a good idea anymore? And they came around and put out this big old publication that said, no, this is not working. It's not good for kids. It's really not going well at all. It's actually pretty sad what we're doing. And we should not do that anymore. Keeping in mind that came out of the progressive era. So the progressive era, when they're also like, hey, we probably shouldn't have little kids working in factories because they have tiny hands, they were also having these types of ideas. Maybe we shouldn't do this type of stuff anymore. But the Merriam Report seemed like it was a turning point. It did start to shift things, but then you have the Kennedy Report in the 1960s, which comes out and says, things still aren't going that well in our Indian school systems. And so those are some of the things lurking behind these, and I encourage you, if you ever want to connect some dots too, look up the history of football at Haskell and Carlisle, because the 1920s, history of football, that stadium you drove by, has anybody driven through Lawrence and driven by the Haskell Stadium? Built in the 1920s, they opened that stadium up against Bucknell, and Quapaw and Osage oil money helped fund that stadium. And so it's just some really interesting history if you get into the football layers, and it can really draw other people into those conversations, because that was the first stadium on this side of the Mississippi with lights. And the Indians were like, we'll just build it ourselves because we want to play some football. So, all right, but I believe that's all the time we have, and everybody join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you very much.